Lecture 5, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Aquinas' Natural Law Theory. 1. Thomas Aquinas, an introduction. Like Kant and Aristotle, there is no way to do Thomas Aquinas justice in a brief introduction, so further research on all of these thinkers is highly encouraged. Thomas Aquinas was truly an intellectual heavyweight in the history of philosophy. He holds titles that rival those of Daenerys Targaryen, including the angelic doctor of the Universal Church, developer of common thought, and the greatest of the medieval philosopher-theologians. He is also recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church, and many common conceptions of ethics, natural law, metaphysics, and political theory are derived from his ideas, especially for Western Christian people and countries. Indeed, his contributions to philosophy, theology, and ordination cannot be overstated, but what our text provides will do for this limited examination of his work. Before we continue through the rest of this chapter, another introduction is in order. An understanding of the nature of God is often required when doing philosophy, especially in the philosophy of religion and some moral theories. God, as discussed in Western analytic philosophy, is roughly consistent with, though not identical to, the God of the Abrahamic traditions, namely, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. However, arguing for or against the existence of God in contemporary philosophy is not necessarily the same as arguing for or against any specific religion. The God of discussion could be called the omni-God of philosophy, omni meaning all. This is because of God's omninature, omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, omniscient, meaning all-knowing, omnipresent, meaning present always and everywhere, and omnibenevolent, all, or supremely, good. God must have all of these qualities. In the Abrahamic religious tradition, God is conceived of as possessing all of these, which leads apologetic philosophers and theologians to adopt and adapt philosophical arguments to suit their needs. We will return to this conception of God periodically. 2. Motivating natural law theory, the Euthyphro dilemma and divine command theory. Divine command theory is an ethical lens through which the moral good is identified by an action's correspondence to God's commands. That which is good because God says it is good, in other words, God commands it. Likewise, what is morally bad is determined by God's forbidding it. This is an early and elegantly simple theory that is embraced by many people all over the world to this very day. However, it is not without its share of difficulties. One difficulty for this theory arises in Plato's early dialogue, the Euthyphro. Socrates asks Euthyphro, is the pious or holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is loved by the gods? Despite claiming expertise in all things divine, this question puzzles Euthyphro and requests that Socrates unpack it, as we will hear. Let's break it down into two questions first and compare them. 1. Is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy? 2. Is something holy because it is loved by the gods? If one were the case, then the gods love holy things because they possess the feature or trait of holiness. If 2 is the case, then holy things gain their holiness by being loved by the gods. For example, an object being carried is a carried object because someone is carrying it, not because it is, by its nature, a carried object. A divine command theorist would answer that the second is the case, namely, that things are holy because God loves them. However, this would mean that holiness is completely arbitrary. If God grew to love atrocities or determined that some horrific acts were holy, then they would be. If the worst behaviors we can possibly imagine could be holy and morally acceptable on this view, then it appears wrong. However, if one is the case, as Aquinas determined, then we find a different problem. If God loves something because of some quality it has that makes it holy or morally good independent of God's command, then that independence is indicative of a limitation of God's power, namely, God cannot determine what is holy and morally good. However, this is incompatible with God's omnipotence, since to be omnipotent is to have unlimited power. So, either way one answers this question leads to difficulties. 3. Natural law theory. Aquinas' natural law theory is composed of 4 interconnected laws: eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Let us set out these laws in order to make sense of the overarching theory. Recall that God is always and everywhere, that is, omnipresent. The eternal law refers to God's rational plan for everything, so it is in the mind of God. God being eternal, anything God has in mind is also eternal. Aquinas, as a teleologist inspired by Aristotle, believes everything has a purpose and follows a plan. Recall our previous discussion of Aristotle's teleology and his argument for reason as the telos of humans. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that reason is our telos, or purpose, as humans, but goes one step further. Not only does fulfilling our purpose well make anything or anyone good, fulfilling our purpose is also to act in accordance with God's plan, the eternal law. The natural law is the harmony that results from everyone fulfilling their purpose. In other words, if we act in accordance with reason, then we are partaking in the natural law. Through reason, Aquinas believes that we can discover, or agree upon some general rules that he referred to as primary precepts. His first primary precept is that good must be pursued and evil must be avoided. This precept should guide and inform all of our moral decision-making. This is a natural law because it is obvious to us through reason. Other such natural laws that Aquinas identified are that we ought to protect and preserve human life, reproduce and educate one's offspring, know and worship God, live in a society. Aquinas considers these primary because everyone can figure them out by reason alone and they apply to everyone. Thus, they are consistent with natural law. Human law is law as we usually conceive it, and made up of what Aquinas calls secondary precepts. Secondary precepts, like federal and local laws, are not necessarily moral in nature. Recall our early discussion on the difference between morality and legality. What is legal is not always moral. For a human law to be morally good, it must be in accordance with natural law. Our text gives the example of women driving in Saudi Arabia, which was, until recently, illegal. Though this is no longer the case, there are places in the Middle East that are patriarchal, meaning, their societies and governments are controlled by men and typically, from a Western or American perspective, controlled unjustly in favor of men. Our text could have used other examples such as niqab face veils, or legal requirements for women to have male guardians, usually their fathers or husbands. Aquinas would likely say all of these examples go against the natural law because, if we reason about them, we should see that they impose different standards based on arbitrary differences such as sex and gender. So, the patriarchal laws are inconsistent with the natural law and, thus, are immoral. Any laws that people think are good, but go against natural law, only appear good, thus Aquinas' terminology apparent good. A real good is when secondary precepts, or human laws, conform to natural law. Aquinas believes we can discover laws in at least two ways, through reason, as we've already seen, and through revelation. It is by revelation that we learn the divine law. The divine law is what God reveals to us through scriptures, such as the Bible. For summary of Aquinas' natural law theory, to fulfill our function, telos, or purpose, namely, acting in accordance with reason, is also to follow the eternal law, God's plan. In the course of our reasoning, we generate the natural law's primary precepts that apply to everyone. From there, as we interact with others in society, we generate secondary precepts that form the human law that applies to people in those societies. As fallible beings, sometimes we get this wrong and generate human laws that are inconsistent with natural law. Since we are fallible, God reveals divine laws to us through scriptures to ensure that we at least do not confuse those. Returning to the Euthyphro dilemma, while Aquinas' theory demonstrates God's role in morality, it does not address the challenge to God's omnipotence. 5. Putting this into practice, the doctrine of double effect. Our text provides examples that demonstrate how straightforward this ethical lens is in identifying moral actions in simple cases. However, in cases where primary precepts seem to conflict, Aquinas appeals to his doctrine of double effect. Our text gives some particularly disturbing examples, so I will not recreate those here. Instead, let's simply work through the doctrine using a general self-defense case. Harming someone would seem to go against the natural law to protect and preserve life. However, Aquinas would have us consider the act itself and the motivation, the internal act. Though one should not compromise someone else's life, if the act's motivation is protecting and preserving one's own life from an attacker, then it is morally permissible. This is due to Aquinas' doctrine of double effect, which states that an act that violates a primary precept can be morally acceptable if it also meets the following 4 criteria. 1. The act must be a good one. 2. The act must come about before the consequences. 3. The intention must be good. 4. The reasons must be serious. We can see that principle 1 is met because preventing harm is a good act. The second principle is met because the harm that the attacker received occurred after the potential victim initiated the act of self-defense. Principle 3 is met because the intention was to prevent harm, protecting and preserving one's own life. Finally, the fourth principle is met because self-defense situations can have life and death consequences. 6. Some thoughts about natural law theory. Our text provides a number of interesting points regarding this theory. However, the first comment regarding our methods when evaluating theories is an important point, so I will share it here verbatim. There are some obvious problems we could raise, such as the problem about whether or not God exists. If God does not exist, then the eternal law does not exist, and therefore the whole theory comes tumbling down. However, as good philosophers we ought always to operate with a principle of charity and grant our opponent is rational and give the strongest possible interpretation of their argument. So, let's assume for the sake of argument that God exists. This principle of charity in our text should be construed broadly. Of course, accepting something for the sake of argument is important, if for no other reason, to see what conclusion follows from the premises. And even if there is a questionable starting point, that doesn't mean there won't be something of value that arises later. From there you can separate the wheat from the chaff and appreciate what value you find. Furthermore, it is very tempting to disregard an entire argument because of a single flaw or fallacy. However, following the principle of charity, instead try to reformulate the poor argument in a way that avoids the flaw or fallacy and appraise the argument from there. It may produce a conclusion that is incompatible with our base camp beliefs, but being right isn't important. In philosophy, it is truth that we are concerned with, not winning debates. In fact, the winner in a philosophical argument is the one who walks away having learned something. As our text proceeds, the is-thought gap reappears, as does the appeal to nature fallacy, and the teleology of both Aquinas and Aristotle is called back into question. The very idea of humans having a purpose is controversial. Indeed, it is a central tenet of existentialism that there is no singular purpose for human life. Simone de Beauvoir is cited for her acceptance of the existentialist tenets that there is no such thing as human nature and no such thing as a human function or goal. This section concludes with questions regarding the viability of the doctrine of double effect and the optimism required to believe that if we all reasoned well enough, we could arrive at the same moral truths that constitute the natural law. 7. Summary. As our text says, Aquinas was an intellectual giant. He wrote an incredible amount covering a vast array of topics. His influence has been immense. His central idea is that humans are created by God to reason. That is our function. Humans do the morally right thing if we act in accordance with reason, and the morally wrong thing if we don't. Aquinas is an incredibly subtle and complex thinker. For example, his doctrine of double effect makes us reflect on what we actually mean by actions, intentions, and consequences. His work remains much discussed and researched and typically still plays a central role in a Christian ethics that rejects divine command theory. 8. Questions and tasks. Though our text asks 12 interesting questions in the issues to consider section, please at least answer the following before next time. 1. We might answer the arbitrariness dilemma by citing God's nature. Why might this answer be problematic? 2. Just as a good eye is to see, and a good acorn is to grow, then a good human is to what? How are we going to finish this sentence? 3. People often talk about what is natural. What do you think they mean by this? How useful is the notion of natural in a moral theory? 4. What are natural laws and primary precepts? Before we conclude, let us analyze a moral problem using the ethical lens of Thomas Aquinas' natural law. Let us consider again the trolley problem. 5 people tied to one track, 1 person tied to the other track, and there is a lever next to you that could redirect the train, except this time the trolley is headed towards the 1 person. Looking at this scenario through the utilitarian lens, the answer is simple: do not touch the lever and let the 1 die to save the 5. But if we identify the 1 as our mother, not factoring this into our moral calculus seems wrong. Now, what will we see if we evaluate this situation through the ethical lens of natural law theory? We will have to consider natural law, divine law, and whether the doctrine of double effect is relevant. As we've seen, for Aquinas, natural law includes the primary precept of protecting and preserving life. But it is not clear how this should guide us independently of a utilitarian moral calculus that concludes, 5 lives saved equals more lives protected and preserved. Since it is unclear, we need to turn to the divine law revealed to us by God in the Scriptures. Here again, however, we find conflicting guidance. We find that the 5th of the 10 Commandments is to honor our fathers and our mothers, which may suggest that we redirect the trolley off the track that our mother is on, towards the other 5 people. However, we also see that the very next, 6th Commandment says that we shall not kill. Now we need to check the relevance of the doctrine of double effect. If we pull the lever, we kill 5 by our action, breaking the 6th commandment, and if we don't pull the lever, we'll kill 1 by our inaction, breaking the 5th and 6th commandments. Therefore, we elect to pull the lever and save Mom, thus honoring our mother but condemning 5 others. Now let us analyze this decision using the double effect checklist. 1. The act must be a good one. 2. The act must come about before the consequences. 3. The intention must be good. 4. The reasons must be serious. Our act is to save our mother's life, so it is good, and that satisfies 1. We do pull the lever to save her before the trolley kills the other 5, so that satisfies 2. Our intention is to save Mom, which is good according to divine law, so this decision passes 3 as well. And the reasons are very serious, so we can put a check next to 4 as well. So, it looks like, through the natural law ethical lens, this was the morally right decision. And yet, something still doesn't feel right about killing 5 to save 1, even though the point of our action was to save 1, not to kill 5.